Hey, how's it going again, class? This is Mr. Miles coming at you with, of course, another podcast. And today, what we're going to be looking at is we're going to be looking at chapter 3, lesson 3. So I guess it works out anyway. So what we're looking at today is we're looking at plant structures. And we are going to go through and identify each of the individual ones. So on this next page, we're just going to take a look and we're going to draw out a very basic plant. So here's our lovely ground, here's our root system, here's our stem, and this ugly bush right here. Let's make it colorful and beautiful. Let's see, it's going to let me do that. Let's make this green, just so we know that these are leaves and not just a weird fuzzy tree. Okay, so what we're looking at here is we are going to be taking a look at all the individual structures of it. What you're going to see is there are different types that either the roots, the stem, or the leaves can be, and different smaller structures that I do need you to memorize so that you'll be able to do good on the test. So the first thing we're going to look at is we're going to concentrate on the roots. So the roots, they're going to have two main things for the plant. The first one is it's going to give it structure. The second thing it's also going to be doing is it's going to be taking in water. Now you got to understand that the leaves and the stem of the tree do not take in water. That's going to happen down at the roots. Also, along with that, so these are the two main ones, it's also going to have nutrients that it takes in from the soil. But also, when I mean structure, I mean it's going to give it support. It's going to allow the tree to be able to stand up. Because again, if it was really shallow like this, a simple wind can come and just knock it over. You need to have something strong down here that can hold all the weight of a large tree or even a smaller plant. It still needs to have its roots deeply embedded. Now, you can have two different types of roots. The ones that I drew here is kind of an ugly one, but you're going to have something like this called a fibrous root system. And this is where you have roots that just kind of branch out in all directions. Or you can have the taproot system, where you're going to have a main root that comes right down the middle, so it would come down like this, and all the roots would branch off of it. Now in the desert, we're mostly going to see fibrous root systems, and that helps them out a lot because there's no groundwater in Las Vegas. It's a very dry place, so it tries to spread itself out as much as possible, so that way when it rains, it can absorb all of that. A taproot system is more for if you do have an underground water source that the root system can try and grow into. Now, if you're looking at a root, you're going to notice a few things about it. So if you were to take a microscope and check out a root, you notice up in front, you have something called a root cap. And what a root cap does is a root cap is actually there for protection. As the roots grow in through the ground, it needs to have a way to protect all of these cells back here, because these are going to be the dividing cells. The thing that you'll learn about plants is the only parts that actually divide in a cell is the stem won't grow out. So if you were to tie a ribbon around the stem right here, it would be in the exact same space 20 years later. But if you were to look at these cells right here, which we're looking at right here, these ones are dividing and constantly pushing these roots out. And the same thing happens on the stems. They push the ends of the stems and the leaves out. Now inside here you're going to have the xylem and phloem, and remember the phloem's going to be bringing the food down to the roots, because remember the food's made up here in the leaves with photosynthesis. But it's going to be using that xylem to transport that water up into the leaves so that they can perform photosynthesis. Okay, then the next thing we're going to look at, and again if you're following along, we were on page 101, we're moving on to page 102. We're going to be looking at stems. Now there's two types of stems we can have. We can have either woody or herbaceous. Now if you're looking at a tree, it's pretty easy to identify that it would be a woody stem. And the other one would be herbaceous, and that would be if you're looking at most types of flowers. If you're looking at, just think of a dandelion, like those kind of easy to break, herbaceous. Now, in the structure, again, we're not going to go too much into detail with this. I just want you to understand the basics. The outside of it's going to be the bark, but that's something that you've already known. Inside there, you're going to find the xylem and phloem. And something that you may be familiar with, if I were to take this and cut this off and turn it outside, you'd be looking at something like this. And you guys are probably very familiar with tree rings. And the thing with tree rings is you can actually count the number of tree rings to tell how old the tree is. Each one will show a growing season. Now there are some really cool stuff that you can do with these tree rings, like tell the amount of water that was how much water it had that year. If there was a drought, you can measure the amount of CO2 in the atmosphere during that time. And we'll do that in class, and we'll have fun with some of the annual tree rings. And the last one, and where we get a lot of stuff in, is where we're looking at the leaves. So looking at the top part. Now we're looking at the leaves, there's a few structures that are extremely important to the leaves. One of them is a structure that helps alleviate a problem that a lot of trees have. The thing is, trees, in order to do photosynthesis, these leaves, in order to do it, they need to take in CO2. Now if you remember, these leaves are covered with a waxy coating. And can you try and guess what that waxing coating is? Yes, it's the cuticle. The cuticle makes it so water can't leave through the leaves, but it also makes it so the CO2 can't get in. So they run into a problem. So what trees, or what leaves have, is they have these little things called stomata. And what a stomata is, it's an opening inside the leaf. So if we were to look at a leaf, if we were to magnify it, we'd see these little openings inside of the leaf. Now the big problem with having openings in the leaf, as you can guess, is it counteracts what that cuticle does, and it lets water come out. Well, the way that stomata work is they are able to open and close. And during the daytime, you can probably guess that they're going to be closed because that's when it's the hottest, the sun's out. And also at night, they can open up. That way it's a little bit cooler, the sun's not glaring on it, and they can have a lot less water loss while taking in CO2. You can probably also guess where the stomata would be located. Yes, that's right, they'd be located on the bottom of the leaf. And again, the same reason is, as heat rises, it doesn't want the water to be able to come out. It makes it a lot more difficult for it. Now, when it loses water, we don't call this evaporation when it's called coming from a plant. When a tree or plant loses, when it loses water, we call this transpiration. And it's a very important word. Again, you're going to use it a lot throughout your educational career, and you'll use it again next year in earth science because it's an important part of the water cycle, and we'll talk about that more later this year. Okay, so that's that. Now the next thing we're going to check out is we're going to check out how do seeds become plants. And I'm just going to very minorly touch on the stuff that comes in through the book. We're going to talk about this a lot in class. We're going to do a lot of drawings with this. So again, don't feel like this podcast is going to give you everything you need. And again, if you have any questions, make sure you talk to me. Now, the thing that we have to understand is plants are going to interact the same way that any other sexual organism is going to go. You need a male and you need a female. With the male, you need the sperm. And with the female, you need the egg. And in the male, the sperm is transported through pollen. And in female, it's just the egg. We give it the same kind of thing. So what can happen is you can have the pollen be transported to the female part of the plant. And you want it to be a different plant. Again, we talked about this earlier in class, why it's so important to try and reproduce with organisms that have genetic differences than you do. But this pollen is going to combine with this egg, and it creates something called a zygote. The zygote is the fertilized egg, which will eventually grow into an embryo. And this embryo is going to be stored. It's going to be stored inside of a seed coat. So this embryo will eventually be stored inside of a seed coat. So let's draw this layer. This will be our seed coat to protect it, again, because the world is a harsh place. And in there, we're also going to have our cotyledons. And if you remember, we have our monocots and our dicots. So if I have two cotyledons, we know that this is a dicot. And then it also has a food source for it. So all these things are going to be helping the embryo grow and eventually find a spot where it can develop into a plant. Now, the way it can do this is by being dispersed. So you have something called seed dispersal. With seed dispersal, it can either be transported by animals, transported by wind, and we'll talk about the different advantages and disadvantages of both. And then it waits for something called germination. And what germination is when it begins to grow. And how does it know when to do this? Well, it waits for a lot of H2O. It waits for water. Now the whole thing is plants are very careful about when they start to germinate, because if they germinate too early, the big problem they run into is it could get really cold and they could die. That's in the season. If it germinates too late, it's already lost out on the competition for food, well, for light source, and for a place to actually grow. So it uses H2O, the amount of rainfall, because it rains a lot more in the spring, and it uses that as a signal for when it actually should start to germinate. And we'll talk about that more in class again. Now the last thing we're going to look at, we're going to look very briefly at this, is we're going to be looking at the structures of a flower. So again, you're going to want to look on page 109. It's going to show you all the different structures of a flower. And the two main things that we're just going to talk about just really briefly here is we have our pistils and our stamens. Pistils, this is going to be the female parts, and this is going to be our male parts. Okay, and again, we're going to be doing a drawing in class that you can use to kind of study this up. Again, look on page 109 to understand what the female parts are and what the male parts are. There's actually a few. Now, the best way to remember that the pistil would be the female parts is, you remember, girls are very deadly with pistols, and I think we use like Kiss and Kate. I think she's from Holes last year. Some kid had used that to always remember that Kiss and Kate, she was deadly with her pistols. And then for stamens, you guys will find out as you get married and you get older. Your wife will be able to tell you what to do. So when she's always, you say you want to go out and, go to Buffalo Wild Wings with your friends, she says, no, you're going to stay, men. You're going to stay, man. So it's a dumb thing. You can probably come up with something better. But pistils, female, stamens, male. Okay, so again, make sure you study this hard. Make sure you look over the drawings that we made in class, and that'll help you out a lot. So until next time, I will talk to you later.